Okie people, welcome back. Hopefully you've had a pleasant 2 weeks, pretty much locked inside your homes. This feels slightly surreal, to be honest. It sort of feels more weird coming back to doing this than it did sort of starting out doing it in the first place. But there we go. We're back on to teaching people. So today we're going to look at Hector. Then tomorrow I'll do a kind of more miscellaneous bit around History Boys, just picking up on things that we've not necessarily picked up on elsewhere. But then at that point, we've done pretty much enough around the History Boys to then kind of build on as we go to Brody and to make sure you've got enough to do the kind of the coursework. So in terms of this week, today Hector, tomorrow miscellaneous bits. For the later in the week session, the Friday session, when you get back, either when you get back or at some point soonish, I say soonish, you're still looking at kind of over a month away, I'd have thought at this stage, there will be some kind of mock that you're either going to complete when we reopen or via the internet. And that mock is going to be Hamlet extract question, Hamlet debate question, and then a question on Gatsby. So the other thing that we'll be doing alongside that is we'll just be doing some stuff around kind of revising over Hamlet, Gatsby, getting in kind of critical responses in relation to them. Okay, so that will be kind of Friday, and then at least one lesson every week, just kind of recalling that as we bring in the Prime and Miss June Brody as well. Okay, so I have been warning you about this for ages, but you need to make sure you've got your copy of the Prime and Miss June Brody. We will be starting on that next week. Hopefully you've already read it. You know, you've had ages of warning around this. It's not terribly long. Now, in relation to Hector, what we're looking at, first thing I'll do is just give a quick feedback in terms of the Plath drafts. I'll be sending those back to you shortly. Then as we go into Hector, we need to think and just recall the three main coursework questions, because it's been a while since we looked at that. You've had a whole 2 weeks break off this. Because then we'll talk around him in relation to those questions, seeing how it links into those questions. I'm going to make sure I'm kind of linking into the different assessment objectives as we go through and discuss Hector and the depiction of Hector, because this is, remember, is the only piece of work where all 5 assessment objectives are coming into it. So I want to keep bringing those in, seeing how we're linking those together to create our good points at the end of this. And identifying simply some specific areas of the play in which we're going to look at Hector. Now, we've already looked at Hector in relation to him as a kind of foil character to Erwin in terms of the kind of educational policy, the way they see learning. Today we're going to focus more around Hector's kind of sexuality, Hector as a kind of an abuser, and Hector and his kind of indiscretion, shall we put it. Towards the end, I'll link in kind of a critical response that I found. I think it's quite an effective one to start it out. It's also a very good one because they've been very good to us, and they have collected together at the bottom in their kind of bibliography quite a nice list of resources that you might use as part of your further criticism to help you find other bits as well. So we can take that piece of criticism, we can challenge it, we can agree with it, we can also use the references that they've got to take it further. Right, okay, so in terms of the Plath drafts, just kind of clarify a few things. I'll send these back to you tomorrow once you've had a chance to kind of listen to this and you know what's going to kind of come with it. I was really impressed, to be honest. I don't think anybody's completely half-arsed their draft. I think everybody had a good, careful consideration around it. What you'll get back It'll be a Word document. You will need to open it in Word. I think some other programs do as well, but to see all of the comments, you'll need to open it in Word. Otherwise, if you just open it on your phone or something, you'll only see the end comment. I don't think you'll see the side comments as you go down. What you'll note I'll have done with pretty much everyone's, I'll have ended up putting in page breaks simply because I don't like it when the side comments all contract up. I like to be able to see all the side comments. So as you're redrafting, you'll have to kind of take the page breaks out. What I recommend you do, read the end comment first, then read through your own essay with the side comments alongside before you start making changes to it. Don't just start from the top and start making changes to it, because sometimes I'll make another point further down that relates back to that point, and if you just work downwards, then you'll end up kind of possibly having to go back and redo some of the same things that you've already done. Okay, but no, they were good. I think the main thing that people are going to have to do is just drawing out the analysis a bit further, a bit more terminology in. A lot of you are going to have to do some more reworking, mainly because you didn't think about that 45 line limit that is on the sheets and you were told about. You've just gone at it and done the whole of some of the longer poems, which you can't do directly. So some of you will have to scale back some bits of analysis. Make sure you're choosing your 45 line section of the poems, and work around that. Okay. They'll come back to you tomorrow, though. Please, as I say, follow that ordering in terms of going through it, and yeah, be working on those. The deadline for that will be the end of the half term. I think is what we're looking at the moment. Okay. Right. So to kind of discussion around Hector and a reminder of our kind of key questions. So remember, the first one of the questions focuses on what kind of ways that education is presented as dangerous, how the authors present it as dangerous. And obviously with Hector, we've talked about his educational policy, but Hector is an abuser. Hector is a character who is taking his position of power and using it in an immoral way. So this represents another danger to us that can obviously be worked into that danger question. Now the second question that you can choose, obviously there's some crossover here. The focus particularly on teachers, but in terms of this one, the ways in which their influence is presented as abuse, well, this one gives you kind of a bit more of a nuance to it. You're kind of arguing around, well, is this abuse from Hector? Is it something different? How are we going to approach Hector's kind of actions? And how are you going to kind of discuss it on a scale of abuse almost? And then the last one we need to kind of think around, explore gender and sexual dynamics. Well, in terms of this one, why does Hector perpetuate what he's doing? Obviously it's got a sexual angle to it, so what is it that Bennett is suggesting is kind of at the root cause of this kind of behaviour in relation to his kind of sexuality? Right, first thing that you need to do, simply think around these questions. Just spend a few minutes thinking back over the play as a whole in general rough note form. Jot down any ideas. How exactly do you respond to Hector? So your personal response, what do you think of Hector at the end of the play? Does your response, is that a fixed response? Do you respond differently to him at different points in the play? So think back over the play. Are there points where you potentially feel more sympathy for him? Are there points where you find him despicable? Where do you kind of change? And just have a kind of consideration. So you need to place your own view of Hector against other people's views of Hector and how they will respond at different kind of points in time, okay, potentially. Now, I've popped AO1 next to that simply because the way that you're thinking about this in an overall way now, it will be part of you forming your lines of argument for those questions. So you need to think how you're introducing these lines of arguments, what kind of things are you going to say, then you'd move into the evidence and the kind of reasoning underneath it. So just having a general think about this now will help you hit that kind of AO1. So first thing I want you to do, just pause it, spend kind of 5-10 minutes, just think back over the play, recall it all, think about different bits of it, think about where your kind of response to him differs at different points, and try and don't just think good, bad, try and put that response into kind of words, okay? Okay, so in terms of Hector, you want to kind of come, hopefully, to the conclusion that it's not as straightforward as simply disdaining him or, coming across him and kind of reflecting on him as simply an abuser. Bennett doesn't reveal his abuse at the very start. The way his abuse is revealed isn't always in a kind of completely predatory way. That at various points we see Hector genuinely kind of suffering, and this kind of adds a degree of sympathy. But at the same time, we cannot get away from the fact that he is, in many ways, an immoral character. And what you potentially will come across, or what you will come across even, as you look at kind of different views and perspectives across this, is that very often people see Erwin as the villain. They don't consider Hector the villain. That is the kind of more predominant prevailing view, especially as you go backwards towards the kind of earlier reviews of the play. It's only a kind of more modern concept to really draw out Hector's villainy in far more kind of stark terms here within the play. So as you're kind of constructing these arguments, you can say Hector's a complete danger, you can say that his actions are disturbing, you can call him an abuser, but you must be aware of these kind of nuances going through. You must be aware that you can kind of argue, we say this is a way that he can be viewed, and you can then argue against it. You don't just want to write it in one side, because otherwise you're going to miss out on your kind of AO5 and the different interpretations as well. Now, the next thing to just kind of briefly consider around this is why these kind of changes in the perception of Hector. Again, it kind of takes it back to where we kind of first started when we were looking at the History Boys. Just think about what's changed between when it's first set, when it's first played, and how we view it now. Why might those depictions, or why might those responses even to Hector have changed over time? Okay, just have a quick think about it. This should only take a couple of minutes, it should just be a recall. Okay, so with this context, you can potentially work it in, you use this as part of your response, so you're thinking, you're moving from that first kind of point here. The depiction of Hector is kind of ambiguous, it's nuanced, there's a kind of, people are debated around how he's kind of seen, and you then want to kind of link it into the context. Well, this is potentially due to the fact that we are living in a changing kind of society. These kind of abuses of power and trust used to be, if you take it back to when it's set in the 80s, you did have a kind of looser definition. It's not written into law in the same way. There are kind of documented cases of people kind of getting away with it, of institutional cover-ups that are only now in kind of contemporary society being kind of looked back on, and prosecutions for things that happened years and years ago are finally happening. And you've got various kind of legal bits that have come in terms of kind of child protection, in terms of kind of vetting of teachers that have happened in the intermediary time. And you've also got kind of key events, key kind of consciousness events, like kind of Jimmy Savile, like kind of Me Too movement, that, have really shifted people's perceptions. Things that weren't normalized but were kind of allowed to go on with, are now kind of challenged in a far more overt way. So again, think about this. This is going to be built in to your kind of arguments as you go in, you look at Hector alongside it. Now, we then need to think about the actual kind of evidence you're going to use in order to do this. I've got kind of 4 main areas of evidence we'll look at. And as you're looking at this evidence, you need to be thinking about this, not just describing it in terms of plot. Remember, you're using this, you're thinking about the kind of methods employed by Bennett in order to kind of either create sympathy, to present him as an abuser, to explore what motivates him as the kind of character that kind of Bennett's created. So the first thing that we want to look at, and this kind of links into the AO1 in terms of terminology, the AO2 in terms of kind of our evidence and actually talking around this, is the initial kind of characterization of Hector. So we've looked at this briefly, as I say, in terms of the foil character. But what I want you to do, I want you to have a look at that initial introduction of him. And as you're looking at it, pay particular attention to the kind of the stage directions, because we get no kind of actual direct dialogue around him really at this point. And think about how it kind of builds sympathy for him, how it hints at the kind of abuse, how it suggests the source of the kind of abuse here, what it is that Bennett is kind of bringing in as the source of this abuse, and which bits of evidence you would kind of pick in. Now, the focus on this is going to be kind of on page 3 to page 4, just that initial introduction where you get that stage direction, so the bit directly following on from kind of Irwin's speech to the Parliament. Okay, now the first thing that I would potentially point out here in this introduction with Hector, the general setting is a sixth form classroom in which the boys in the 80s in the north of England, when Hector first comes in motorcycle leathers and a helmet, the stage is empty. So Hector enters, he enters in these kind of motorcycle leathers, and that kind of choice in terms of how Hector is depicted, if we generalize here, and you are kind of playing with stereotypes, so don't take it kind of too far in terms of depiction here, but if you think about that typical association with kind of bikers, with that kind of area, it's generally seen as something kind of very masculinized, a kind of masculine world. So Hector appears kind of very masculine, and it then kind of follows on. His sixth formers, 8 boys of 17 or 18, come briskly on and take Hector out of his motorcycle gear. Now, this is important. Bennett explicitly in the stage directions points out that these boys are 17, 18, they're sixth formers. Now, this isn't to write off the abuse, but you will see Hector described at various different points in different articles at certain points. The one I'm going to use later on is going to describe him in this way as a paedophile. Now, if these students are 17, 18, and Bennett is drawing our attention to that, it doesn't mean that Hector isn't an abuser, but what it does mean that is that he isn't a paedophile. So I'd recommend you don't kind of express it in those terms, but it is still sexual abuse, and it's not something to be kind of written off. I'm not attempting to write it off, but just, you know, Bennett is mitigating somewhat his actions. If we had a much younger student group here, Hector's actions would be entirely reprehensible. But as we look at it, Hector is kind of exerting his authority over an older age group. So it doesn't write it off, but it doesn't make it quite the same. Now, what you then get, each of them kind of removing this kind of aspect in a kind of like squires would undress a kind of armored figure. And this links in with kind of Hector as, well, his namesake, as a kind of warrior figure, as this kind of hyper masculinized warrior figure. I've got the picture of it here, or one of the pictures of it, of kind of Hector's body being carried off after Achilles has kind of released it back to Priam. And they're kind of stripping off this armor. So his motorcycle leather, something that represents his kind of masculinity, is kind of stripped away from him, revealing the reality of what exactly Hector is. And it kind of, as we go down, taking off the helmet reveals Hector, which is both his surname and his nickname, as a schoolmaster of 50 or so. Hector is a man of studied eccentricity. He wears a bow tie. So underneath this kind of armor of masculinity, Bennett reveals somebody kind of more aging, somebody more vulnerable. He reveals to us a character who is actually kind of eccentric. The bow tie kind of marks him out and kind of suggests this kind of more hidden, repressed sexuality potentially that goes with Hector. And it's important that it's kind of the boys that are undressing him. They're using the kind of the French terms for the items. So it kind of stresses his position within the educational establishment, and that kind of that they are the ones who reveal his kind of true sexuality within him. Okay, so Hector's sexuality starts to be introduced. It suggests that he's repressing something, hiding something. There's kind of armor on the outside of it. The boys here are revealing it, but we can also link it into the kind of dangers and abuse question in the Bennett draws our attention to their kind of age in the stage directions here, and then obviously on stage if you're watching it as a performance. There's a kind of playfulness to this as well. So the next point that we kind of go on to will kind of build on this, but the boys don't seem afraid of Hector. They're not depicted as worried by Hector. They're not depicted as traumatized by Hector. So as you're linking into that kind of abuse question or the dangers, you can talk around, well, what level of danger there is there, what level of abuse there is there in terms of how Bennett is kind of depicting it. So as we go through, I want you to kind of build on this. Now, I want you to think about Hector in different ways, and the first way I want you to think about it is in terms of how the boys across the text respond to Hector's kind of advances. Do they suggest that Hector's abuses are traumatic, or do they suggest that they're kind of taken with an element of humour, that they don't view Hector as a kind of threatening figure? So my suggestion here would be used around kind of page 7, page 17, page 76 to 77. Have a look through those. This bit, I think, spend a little bit longer on this. Spend about kind of 10 minutes. Go back through it. There'll be bits that we've already looked at briefly, but you're thinking about this in relation to kind of Hector and his kind of advances on them at this point. Okay, so in terms of the bit on page 7, and I'm going to cheat and I'm going to use part of page 6 as well. It references here, Dakin, you're hitting us again, sir. So you've got the reference on stage, you've got this physical interaction in terms of stage direction of nothing kind of sexualized yet at this stage, but of a kind of physical abuse here. And Hector's response, child, I am your teacher. Whatever I do in this room is a token of my trust. I'm in your hands. It is a pact, bread eaten in secret. Now, this is an interesting kind of image here. You can talk about it as kind of a metaphor. There's no literal pact here, but it suggests something that kind of supposedly runs two ways. You get "I am in your hands." However, you get the reference here. He talks to him as child, so it does draw out the kind of power dynamic, adult to child here. Um, Now, as we go on to page 7, you get Tim's. Now, we talked already before about kind of in the play, the breaking of the fourth wall. Now, Tim's here does kind of break the fourth wall. He's suddenly, from the present tense of the play, he's looking back at it retrospectively. The hitting never hurt. It was a joke. None of us cared. We lapped it up. So, as we're introduced to the ways in which Hector is potentially a kind of an abusive figure, as they look back at it, there's a kind of diminishing on it. It never hurt. It was a joke. So, as we move into the past tense within this, we're breaking the fourth wall. We're looking back retrospectively, and they kind of diminish the abuse. The boys actually kind of reduce it. And again, we get another metaphor, we lapped it up. So there's actually a sense that they're amused by it, that they're lapping it up metaphorically, sort of is eating it up. And that there's no sort of sense they're actually kind of enjoying it rather than being disturbed by it. And he hits you if he likes you, he never touches me. There's almost actually within the hitting element an element of kind of seeking this, of it as being kind of a form of accomplishment. And Dakin says happily, I'm black and blue. So the stage direction, the implication of voice shows that Dakin, at least at this, is not kind of disturbed by it in any way. Okay, then we get the bit on page 17. So again, bear in mind kind of structurally where this appears. So this is following on from the brothel scene, where we've seen a kind of inappropriateness to this. We've also seen the boys kind of defending Hector, which we've kind of talked about before. And you get that kind of invitation onto the motorcycle. And whilst he does have initially the kind of boys presented as coming up with excuses, no, not me, sir, going into town, off for a run, sir, computer club, sir. And then Posner actually asks to doing it, I'll come, sir. And there's almost a sense of lamentation as I'd go, I'm never asked to go. So Posner is excluded from this. You could potentially explore around that. And scripts too, and yes, it's described as kind of in a sacrificial way. You get the stage direction resignedly, and you get the kind of reference, the things I do for Jesus, again, giving the image that his joining Hector on the motorcycle is a kind of sacrifice. It's not a pleasurable experience. He still kind of goes through with it, and there's still the kind of amusing comic dynamic to it. As he goes, he gives the finger, gives Dakin the finger, so he swears at Dakin. It's done with a kind of comic tone to this. So this place of abuse is made to seem comic. Yes, Bennett presents a kind of reluctance on the part of the boys, but it's not a fearful reluctance, and they are willing to expose themselves to this without any real fear going alongside. Okay, so in relation to the bit on kind of page 76 and page 77, if you take scripts, so I'm actually going to focus mainly on page 77 more than on page 76. Scripts, sacked, who complained? Now, his interrogatives here, his kind of questions, do suggest that he's surprised that one of the boys would actually kind of complain that he himself has possibly not considered this. So again, as you kind of debate around it, the interrogative becomes important, and they then go on to kind of discuss the lifts, the place where the kind of the abuse is carried out, but they do so in a kind of comic and almost romanticized kind of way. No more gentle massages as one speeds along leafy suburban roads. No more the bike's melancholy, long withdrawing roar as he dropped you at the corner, your honour still intact. So, in terms of the kind of language here, he does romanticize it. There's something of the poetic within this in terms of the way he kind of almost seemingly idealizes the experience for comic effect. Now, you could argue that this is a kind of deliberate underplaying to kind of hide the true feelings around this. But it does kind of suggest again that they're not as traumatized as maybe you would expect by the kind of experience and this kind of abuse. And Dakin kind of questions almost rhetorically as he kind of goes through, are we scarred for life, do you think? So he does suggest the potential for Hector's actions to cause a lasting damage in a kind of metaphorical way, but Scripps, as he kind of responds to this, we must hope so. Perhaps it will turn me into Proust. And this is important because, again, you get the kind of idea that this is presented as kind of almost a rite of passage, that the experience it's a life experience to them. I hope so. You get the intertext allusion to Proust, who is the famous kind of French novelist. He's a kind of repressed homosexual himself. Well, they're so repressed. Obviously, he's living at a time where it's illegal to be homosexual, but he visited brothels. He had several well-documented affairs with men. So Scripps kind of suggesting here, perhaps it will, his experiences with Hector, scarring by Hector will turn him into somebody kind of famous, influential, that it will affect his own sexuality. So again, that kind of comic element that goes with it downplays it. The romanticism downplays it. There is a suggestion of lasting damage, but again, this is kind of written off by Bennett here in terms of the kind of boys' responses to this. Now, the next bit you need to look at is kind of where you get the kind of Hector's confronted with his own behaviour. Now, both the headmaster and Mrs. Lintott do this. You get the headmaster's confrontation on page 51 to 53 and Mrs. Lintott's on page 95. Now, what I want you to do as you look at these, have a look at both of them. Think about the way that Bennett kind of constructs Hector's response here. Does he suggest that Hector sees his own actions as immoral? Is there a sense of kind of shame depicted within Hector? Or is he kind of presented as almost the victim here? So have a look at these areas of the text. Again, you're looking for kind of techniques used. You're thinking about how you can kind of debate around Bennett's depiction of Hector. Again, I want to stress this point. You don't have to agree with how Bennett is depicting Hector. You want to be able to look at how Bennett is depicting Hector, the techniques used, and you can then challenge this. You can say that, this underplays it, that there's something disturbing around it. But you want to kind of engage with Bennett's intentions as well as your own kind of views here, okay? Again, have a look at both. I would suggest kind of 10-15 minutes to look at it, to pick out the kind of key quotations that you think are going to allow you to discuss around this. Okay. So within this section, we've got various bits that we can look at. Now, again, Bennett clearly shapes a sense of kind of sympathy around Hector. We get the references to his wife, and there's a sense of kind of distance created between Hector and his wife. And I have no idea what women know or don't know has always been a mystery to me. So Hector here is presented as kind of, naive is the wrong word, but there's a sense of him as kind of lacking in understanding, essentially. It's always been a mystery to him. So that kind of adverb there, he's never understood this truly himself. And I don't know, I'm not sure she'd be interested. So the idea that his own relationship with his wife is unfulfilling, is kind of distant, is designed to shape a kind of sympathy here. It suggests that his actions and his abuse are linked to the kind of unfulfilled nature of his own sexuality. And the fact that kind of society has essentially forced him into something more conventional when it runs against his kind of better instincts, essentially. And as it kind of progresses through, Hector kind of, he's being challenged on this behaviour, but whilst he's presented as kind of upset at losing his position, at having that kind of role taken away from him, there's never really a sense of him as directly ashamed by his actions. So if you look at kind of on page 53, a hand on a boy's genitals at 50 miles an hour, and you call that nothing. So we've talked before about the headmaster, how he moves from kind of euphemism to the kind of more direct and disturbing depiction of this. But Hector's response, the transmission of knowledge itself is in itself an erotic act in the Renaissance, and he's then cut off. But this is one of the more kind of important bits around Hector and this kind of depiction of it. He kind of collocates, so he places side by side, he connects the act of education with something kind of erotic. He draws a parallel between them, and suggests that essentially his actions are simply a continuation of his academic positioning. Now, yes, Bennett has it cut off, but he sort of has Hector introduced in the Renaissance. Now, what this kind of draws out is that our social attitudes towards relationships like this have changed over time, is what kind of Bennett is indicating here. And he does this both through the reference to the Renaissance, also to Hector's name and the link back to the kind of Greek within that. And he shows that kind of shifting attitude towards homosexuality, towards these kind of relationships between kind of teacher and pupil, and that at different points in history, these kind of relationships have actually been legitimized rather than kind of seen as damaging and disrupting. So with Bennett drawing our attention to that again, it's another way of potentially underplaying Hector's behavior, of showing Hector or characterizing Hector as not being ashamed of this kind of behavior as part of it. And he continues this with the confrontation by Lintott later on, where Lintott kind of challenges him this as well. And again, it's Lintott's reaction to this underplays it again. So, 2 seconds while I find the bits I want. Right. Okay. So yeah, as we kind of go down, Hector's kind of presented as again aware of his own kind of inferiority in many ways. As he's talking to kind of Erwin, he'll think that you're a fool. That's what they think about me. So there's a sense of kind of introspection, of self awareness. But the bit with kind of Lintot is more telling. Mrs. Lintot kind of challenged, well, of course the boys knew. They had it firsthand. And Hector, again, this kind of denial of the immorality that goes with it. It was a laying on of hands, I don't deny that, but more in benediction than gratification or anything else. So he kind of is presented as underplaying his actions. You get this religious imagery used in association with this laying on of hands, this benediction. And whilst Lintot is presented as kind of challenging him on this, it comes with that kind of sympathetic element as well. Hector, darling, love you as I do. So again, building a sense of sympathy, showing that dynamic, showing that other characters don't condemn him for his actions. That is the most colossal balls. A grope is a grope. It is not the Annunciation, you twerp. So within this, we've got kind of Lintot, yes, challenging Harmony, yes, kind of denying his lack of responsibility, that negation there. It's not the Annunciation. She denies his religious metaphor. So Bennett does have her challenging him on this, but at the same time, it doesn't necessarily take away from Hector's sort of depicted lack of shame within this. A final bit to kind of consider here is the kind of final eulogizing of Hector at the end. So again, we've looked at this in various different ways, but look at the end of the play here. Think about everything we've seen of Hector, and then think about how Bennett kind of constructs the ending of the play, how he kind of depicts the ending of the play, how he shapes our sympathy around Hector at the end here. So again, stop, pause, have a look at it, see what bits you would pick out first. Okay, so a couple of bits we'll point out from this kind of end, this eulogizing of him here. Crowther on page 107, I'm going to kind of pick out at the top of the page. He was stained and shabby and did unforgivable things. So Crowther's discourse at the end here, Bennett has him kind of initially seeming to kind of condemn Hector. He does unforgivable things, so our adjective there suggests something immoral. He himself is kind of stained and shabby, and this doesn't necessarily mean in a simply literal sense. It can be meant in a metaphorical sense as well. You then have the shift, though, in Crowther's discourse at the end here, the but. So you can talk about Bennett's use of kind of conjunction here, and the way it kind of shifts it back to a more sympathetic view of Hector. But he led you to expect the best. And even in his death, even his death was a lesson even and added to the store. So Hector is almost presented as kind of a martyr here at the end. His death is a lesson. They grow from it. It becomes something kind of more essentially. Then the other bit I'll kind of point out is that Hector gets the final words of the play. Hector is kind of, he's eulogized. You get the whole funeral. They sing to him, and you get Hector coming back on in this kind of symbolic way. The ghost of Hector almost kind of re-entering, and they kind of pass the parcel. That sometimes all you can do, take it, feel it, pass it on. Not for me, not for you, but for someone somewhere else. Someone, pass it on, boys. That's the game I wanted you to learn. Pass it on. And dun 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 dun. Yeah, finish, good lady, the bright day is done, and we are for the dark. So there's something kind of tragic about the ending. Hector's desires are presented as something, you know, again, non-threatening. There's something admirable in his desires to simply pass on the knowledge, the joy around the education. It draws our attention away from the abusive aspect to this at the kind of closing point of the play. So there are lots of bits here. If you're discussing Hector in relation to abuse or dangers, yes, you can talk about him as dangerous, you can talk about the abuse, but you can also talk about the ways that Bennett potentially mitigates this, the way that Bennett suggests that there is a danger there, but it's not potentially as dangerous as we might initially expect. If you're talking about Hector's sexuality, you can talk about the way that it's kind of it comes from a place of repression and is then presented as kind of expressed through the students, and as a form of kind of fulfillment, at least to an extent, for Hector. So we can fit these into the different arguments. You can link that into the kind of context that comes alongside. The other bit that we want to do, though, is to be able to work in our kind of critical responses to this. Okay. Now, the one that I want you to do, to have a look at the moment in its kind of more detailed form, if you Google the History Boys hashtag Me Too, you'll get an article. The article should look like that in terms of web address. Now, this is a good article because against what Bennett has done, it provides a point of very strong criticism, and it sort of shows how you get that kind of more appalled critical angle around what Bennett has done. It's also a good article in that it points out the fact that very often other critics are quite sympathetic towards Hector, and it criticises them. So what I want you to do, have a read through that article, and I want you to pick out the bits that you could potentially use to work into an argument around Hector as well, in relation to any of the questions, essentially. And I'm just going to kind of then pick out 4 or 5 bits that I'll kind of discuss in relation to it as well. So stop here, go to the article, read through it, highlighting bits that you can use, and then I'll quickly go through what I think are some of the most useful bits from it afterwards. Okay. Now, I quite like this article. It sets it up nicely because it sort of, as they introduce the article, they introduce, before watching this, their expectation that this is kind of, Alan Bennett as a national treasure, that there's this expectation that the History Boys is, and it is still widely regarded as one of the kind of great plays of the modern era, and the play itself, to the kind of critical voice here, just failed on multiple levels to live up to this expectation. So you've got a critic here who's kind of challenging Bennett's depiction very directly, and there's some kind of key bits as it goes down that I think are very important here. So it never makes the perpetrator confront his actions or the impact on his victims. So it kind of challenges Bennett here. It says that, the play had this opportunity to essentially explore the abuse, to condemn it, but it fails to do that, and it fails to force Hector to look at the impact of his abuse. So in terms of the dangers of education or the abuse question, I think it's a really nice little kind of quotation you could work into that to show that, critics have kind of shown that Bennett underplays it, that Bennett fails in this kind of depiction at various points. As we go further. Okay, so the next bit I'll kind of, or next couple of bits I'll pick out on, will kind of focus on the abuse angle, but also I think link into kind of critiquing the way that Bennett depicts kind of sexuality and kind of gender dynamics as well. So as you kind of go further through the article, it not only confuses pedagogy and pedagogical love for sexual love, but implies that sexual love is necessary for good pedagogy. Now, pedagogy is essentially teaching practice, and it's depicting the kind of the confusion and the failure here, and what the critic sees as a kind of a bad parallel, essentially. So you get that kind of challenge to it, essentially. Now, it goes on from that, and it kind of says, within the play, there is a direct link made between repressed homosexuality and the character's inability to control their sexual urges, manifesting in paedophilia. So, essentially, what the critic is implying here is that in that exploration of kind of repressed homosexuality, it suggests that this is almost inevitably going to lead to something destructive, that it's kind of uncontrollable, that there's a kind of immorality that goes with it. And essentially, whilst Bennett himself is homosexual, he's kind of failed in this depiction, essentially, of showing, you know, the responses to those kind of restrictions placed onto people. And they compare it to Lolita, another kind of famous novel around kind of teacher sort of student relationship, but in a more directly paedophilic way novel. And he sort of says that rather than one or the other, where one is kind of Lolita's sort of disease or an illness, this is, it doesn't depict it in that way. It's simply a kind of failure of morality. It's a story about a teacher, Hector, who is a gay and lonely man and who turns to school children because he can't help himself. And they kind of critique the fact that in the film version, this is suggested as kind of a repeated pattern for all gay figures who are placed in the same position, by having Posner repeat exactly what Hector himself does. So it becomes a kind of strong critique of the way that Bennett presents this, and the failures around it. Yeah, I think the close of their discussion becomes kind of important here, and again, it gives you points you can build in to that kind of criticism. Alan Bennett is but one product of the wider cultural acceptance of abuse within British institutions. The History Boys are loving homage to systematic abuse. We need to reach into Britain's past and confront the nostalgia that must maintain such narratives. So she kind of then places him into a kind of tradition of this, where the abuse is present, but it's romanticized, and they see this as kind of a failure within Bennett's writing and his kind of narrative style, and kind of shows that the danger is essentially underplayed from this point of view. So, you know, I had to Google for this. I had to search through a couple of pages to find that you need to be willing to kind of go out and to find these critical responses. Now, this critical response is good because it references so many other critical responses. And at the bottom of the page, in her bibliography, you have a huge long list with hyperlinks to other articles that you can potentially use when you are kind of forming your responses to this play, answering those questions. And it gives you articles from both sides. So I would suggest what you then go out and do from this point is you start reading through those different articles, start highlighting different bits that would allow you to argue around those different questions, to look at them from kind of both sides. Okay, so just to kind of reiterate, we've looked at Hector today more explicitly in relation to his abuse. We've considered how and kind of potentially why Bennett kind of underplays the abuse, the methods that he uses to do that, and the fact that this is kind of linked to changing kind of social attitudes. And we've seen how kind of more modern criticism kind of goes against Bennett's views and kind of challenges Bennett's views, and starts to give you some ideas how this can be built into your kind of essay responses. Okay, so that's it for today, people. Tomorrow, just kind of some miscellaneous bits, tidying up around the history boys, looking to move on to the Primus June Brody next week. Okay.